Hello, welcome back to my tutorial series on VCV Rack. In this episode, let's take a look at the Befaco modules. So there's an EvenVCO. Let's start off with that. This is an oscillator, similar to our VCO-1 that we saw before. We're starting off this patch with what we saw before, a VCO connected to a VCA that's being controlled by an ADSR and a sequencer. So if we listen to that, this is kind of what we heard before in a previous episode, just some kind of beat. But let's replace our VCO1 with this guy. And then let's look at him in the scope. So we have a triangle wave here, and then we have octaves up here. Super high pitched. Tuning, like we saw before with their, let's get back our LFO actually, our VCO. The tuning, just like we saw with the fine control over here. This is similar to the fine control. But this one adjusts the entire frequency range. This is adjusting octaves. So that's like doubling. And then this is more tuning in between the octaves. Plus or minus 7. Alright, then we have triangle, and let's see, we have sine wave over here. And square wave. And sawtooth. If we go back to our square wave, then we can adjust the pulse width, just like we saw before. And then we have a modulator for the pulse width, just like we saw before with our PWM input. Now there's this other thing in the center called even. Let's take a look at that. So it kind of looks like a sine wave and a sawtooth wave. Kind of see the sine wave here, and you can kind of see a sawtooth here. All right, let's bring up an LFO to control this thing and see what these guys do. So we have our FM just like we saw before. Let's put a VCA in front of that. Actually, we have a Atenuverter. Let's do that instead. Just right to the bottom one. Okay, that's a FM modulation. See, that's a sync one. That's probably similar to what we saw over here with the sync control. I think this is going to control. Let's go back to our sine. This is controlling the octave, so it's a control voltage for this knob. I believe. I could be wrong. Yeah, it's certainly adjusting in the entire frequency range. Whoa, it's super pitchy. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's actually jumping between the octaves, but it is sweeping the entire range on like this one. See, that's a much lower range. If we jack that up, this is basically a +7. This is a control voltage for this guy, and this is a control voltage for the entire sweep, but not in step mode. So that's pretty much it, I think, for this guy. He's pretty similar to VCO1. Alright, let's shut him off and look at the next module in the in this set, Rampage. Now Rampage is similar to the ADSR. It is, over here we can see it is a Logic, Slew Limiter, envelope follower, and dual. Oh, and a function generator too. So if you're familiar with the real modular synthesis, it looks similar to the mass. It's kind of a utility function. It doesn't exactly work the same way, but it's close. So let's route this into, let's put our output into the scope so we can see what's going on. And then we need to trigger it with some kind of clock. We can use this gate, I guess, up here, because it's basically an ADSR. We'll turn on all the gate nodes. Adjust our time. So now we're just getting a spike, an even spike on every beat. So we can play with that spike. So it's basically acting like an ADSR. It's got essentially an attack, a decay, and stuff like this. So if we adjust this rise, so we're basically, there's two halves to this thing. The left half and the right half, and they're basically identical, split down the middle. So if we adjust the rise, you can see it's basically adjusting how long it takes to rise up to the peak. So at the max, it's a very slow rise. And at the mid, it's a very quick rise. Likewise, the fall is the same thing, but for the other side, the fall. So you can see it's falling so slowly that it's spiking again before it falls all the way. So that's those two parameters. Let's see, there's also this knob right here, which allows you to set the curve. So let's look at a slower rise. So as we adjust this knob, you can see how it's shaping the rise and the fall. Let's do a little bit slower. Let's turn off every other beat so we can actually get more time in between these events. Put it up like that, and then shape it like that. So you can see the difference between these two shapes. So it's an exponential up and a kind of an exponential down versus this one, which is the opposite. And right in the center, it's kind of a triangle pattern. There's also this range thing, which I'm not entirely sure what it does. The trigger guy is basically when you want to trigger this ADSR. When you want, it's very similar to what we saw with the gate. And then you have a bunch of stuff down here. So I believe this causes it to recycle itself. Let's take a look at one beat. Let's actually also listen to this thing because it's also useful to do. Let's disconnect our ADSR here and connect this guy here. And then we'll connect in our sine. Turn off our cycle. Put back our beats. So with a very sharp rise and fall, you can hear it's kind of ding, clicky. Oops. If we adjust this guy, it's fairly subtle. So then we have a bunch of events down here. So if we take a look at this event, this is going to happen during the rising section, as you can see here. So if I make this rising section longer, this rising event gate is going to trigger while it's rising. So as I increase this time, that gate gets longer. As I make it shorter, that gate gets thinner. Falling is the same, but for the falling side. So as I make that one longer, end of cycle is just a spike when the entire event is done, when it's fell to the end. So if it re-triggers, does it spike? I don't think it will. Yeah, it doesn't spike. It doesn't get to the end of the cycle. Then you have CVs for the rise and the fall, and then an exponential CV. Let's take a look at that exponential CV real quick. So if we CV the rise, you can kind of see it's going to go nuts here. The rise is going to go super extreme. Here we're making the fall take long and then short, then long, then short. The exponential, let's do something more in the center, slower, so we can actually see it. This might, I think this is controlling. Yeah, it's controlling both of them simultaneously. So sometimes it takes a long time when the LFO is high, and when the LFO is low, it's very fast. Okay, that's that. There's also the cycle knob, which I believe is just causing it to recycle even when there's no trigger. As soon as it's done, just cycle again. So even if you don't hook up a trigger, I think it's just going to keep cycling. If you turn off the cycle mode, then it only triggers once whenever you click this button, or when you send a gate signal through to the trigger. If you turn on cycle, and you push the button, it'll just cycle over and over again, kind of like an LFO. So you can adjust this rise and the fall to kind of adjust the rate of the LFO, essentially. And of course you can adjust the, oops, keep dragging it down, adjust the shape, just the same thing we've always seen. So this is similar to mass, if you are familiar with the real modular synthesis hardware, where you can kind of self-cycle or you can trigger, depending on what you're doing. Now I think this is an LFO to tell it whether it's going to cycle or not. Yeah. It's basically should it self-cycle or should it not? Seat control voltage. So sometimes it's self-cycling, sometimes it's not. So it's kind of a weird one. You might want to do this upon an event or something like this. Like one way they rig up mass in really complicated ways. I recommend you watch videos on mass if you're really interested in learning a lot about this kind of module, because you can basically trigger, like, so when this ends, so let me also talk about, there's a second side, which is the same thing. So you can hook up output B, and let's hook up gates to both of these, or triggers to both of these. And we can see, we should see both of them spike up. So you can see the one side has it kind of, the pink purple is very short, whereas the blue is very long. Now we're also, now that we've activated both sides, we're getting these extra ones in the middle, min, max, and A plus, or B is greater than A. So let's take a look at those. So if we scope min, set our time correctly. So our min is the minimum of any of these values. So a lot of times it's the minimum is 0, because you see how it's, the minimum is here. But when it gets here, the minimum is between the two. It's going to take the least. So it kind of creates these interesting shapes as you adjust this, as you adjust these waveforms, because you can kind of create different different patterns using min. And max is the same thing. It's just going to take the maximum of the two sides. So let's go to max. So this is going to look very similar to our blue curve, but with a spike right wherever this the second half hits. So if we self-cycle this one, we can see our max is getting spikes all the time. And let's route that to max. So you can kind of hear it. It's very subtle. I can turn down the one side and you can kind of hear it going. It's kind of weird. Here's the min. You can kind of see the shape over here, because this one's self-cycling quickly. So you can make it self-cycle slower, get a different shape out. So you can kind of create crazy shapes, obviously, with these two things. The other thing you can do is you can say, okay, when this one ends, I want you to trigger the other one. And then vice versa. When this one ends, I want you to trigger this one. So you can kind of get, and you turn off self-cycling on both of these. So now they're cycling each other. So you can kind of get, you know, when one stops, the other one starts. So kind of events. So you can kind of build your own weird mountain shapes. You could trigger the other one when the falling occurs or when the rising occurs. And then you could look at min or max or whatever. You can get all kinds of crazy shapes out of this thing. And then B is greater than A. Let's look at that. So I think that is going to be true when so balance. It says min max B greater than A. Min max B greater than A. Not quite sure what the B greater than A is. I mean, it's probably this side is greater than this side. But I'm not sure how this interacts with the balance knob. If you know, please leave a comment below. So I think that's most of it. There's also one feature we haven't looked at. So let's get rid of this triggering, self-triggering stuff, make it more simple again. Get rid of all this stuff. All right, so we're just looking at the output of A right now. And let's listen to that. It's pretty simple. But we could just listen to this directly. That's going to be a thump. Now you can actually modulate this signal with an audio signal, like from a VCO. So let's take a sine wave and put that into the in. And so now you can see there's, if you zoom in time, there's actually a sine wave baked into this kind of LFO. And you can kind of hear it too. It sounds kind of nuts. I'm sure you could do interesting things with that input to modulate. I wonder if you took the output of B and added that together. So now I'm adding B to the input of A. between these two. It's kind of neat. All right, I think that's most of it. I think the things I didn't cover is this range, which I don't know. Please leave a comment, and exactly what this balance does. All right, thanks for that. So let's keep going on our Befaco. So we have an A times B plus C. So to see this one, let's rig up maybe an LFO on our A and a triangle on our B. And let's take a look at the output here. So we have a C. Let's make our LFO. Let's do maybe 2 LFOs, duplicate this guy so we can run them at different rates. And let's do a square wave. So you can kind of see how it's getting chopped when that square wave goes 0. Let's actually put the square wave on the purple. So you can see when the square wave is high, we get the output of A times B, because I'm multiplying there. If I set it to 0, then nothing happens. If I put this red knob at 0, nothing happens, because we're, I guess, multiplying the B0 by 0, or the B1 by 0. We could do -2 times 2 times -2 or times 2. I guess this is times 1 right here. Then we also have a C, so we can offset the whole thing if we want to add 1 or subtract 1, depending on where we want this thing to sit in terms of our range. So we can kind of go like that if we want to. Kind of just a math function, so you can kind of either play with audio signals or LFO signals. Kind of cool utility. Spring reverb. So to hear that, let's rig up back this thing. All right, let's put the input into here and the output of the mix into our in, and that's going to sound pretty much the same because it's a spring reverb. It kind of only kind of changes as this CV changes. So let's LFO the CV. Let's actually do a square wave since it'll jump between the two. So that's a dry mix, that's the original. And this is wet. It's kind of it's a reverb that's bringing back to the original. So then you have a mix CV where you can control this big knob, of course. And you have 2 inputs. I'm not sure what this HPF is. Oops. Dragging these things down. Is that a it's not a volume, maybe, I don't know. And then we can listen to the wet signal only, not mixed, which is the same thing as turning this all the way up. So that's a spring reverb. Mixer is a pretty simple mixer. Let's take a look at that. Let's plug our output into our to our scope, plug our, our sine wave into here. We're not going to hear anything. We've got to turn up channel 1. And then plug in the output into our, so now we're back here. So we can turn channel 1 off or full volume. You can also plug in a triangle wave to channel 2. Oops, this one. So it's like mixing them together, as you'd expect. Nothing too extraordinary, but basically it's a 4-channel mixer, which is kind of neat. And then they have out plus and out minus. It's kind of the inverse of this guy. So if you were to LFO a triangle in there, you'd see he's positive and this guy's negative. See, there's our negative triangle, and there's our positive triangle. Now, Slew Limiter is kind of a neat module. Let's take a look at our square wave plugged into this thing. So if we adjust the scale and adjust the time, there's our standard square wave, and the Slew Limiter is not really doing too much, but if we adjust these guys, we can see what the Slew Limiter is doing to it. It's basically controlling how fast it can change. So a square wave wants to jump immediately from 0 to 1 or whatever. Slow it down a bit. Just the time. So it wants to jump immediately from 0 to 1. Now a Slew Limiter says, no, that's too fast, so I'm gonna slow you down based on this slider right here. So you could say, okay, like that. So that might be kind of neat for various things. And you can of course use a Slew Limiter for audio in some cases. We could apply that to our ADSR. See what our ADSR looks like, slew limited, and then route the output to our in there, and then listen to it. So there it is, unslew limited, and here it is slew limited. Kind of makes it softer, not so quick jumps. Let's plug in our sine wave directly to it and see what happens there. So there's our sine wave. If we slew limit it, it starts to become basically a saw. Now this guy also has a shape modifier, so you can modify the shape like we saw before. Kind of makes it back into a saw, into a sine wave. And then of course you can CV both of these sliders, you know, with LFOs or whatever you want to do. So that's a Slew Limiter. Dual Atenuverter. So let's look at the output of the first one. There's 2 of them, one on the top, one on the bottom. So we have an offset from 0 to 1, or -1 to 1, stopping at 0. And then you can modify the input. Let's take a sine wave. So at 0, it's multiplying the sine wave by 0, so you get nothing. Multiplying the sine wave by 1 or -1. So pretty simple control, but useful nonetheless. Kind of similar to what we saw before with our Atenuverter, but it also has a DC offset. Because this is basically just this knob is just this white one. It doesn't have the offset one. So that's the dual Atenuverter. Let's see, I think I covered them all, yeah. Alright, I think that's a good stopping point. I think we've covered, so far, we've covered all the Befaco stuff, the E-Series, the Fundamental, and the Grayscale. Still need to look at the MIDI to CV at some point, and then audible instruments. Audible instruments are very similar to, and ported from, Mutable Instruments, which is a real company that makes hardware modules, modular synth modules. And this is directly from their source code. And they all have different names like clouds and braids and so on. But in VCV Rack, they've renamed them. So at some point, maybe I'll look at these. But some of them are pretty complicated, but interesting nonetheless. All right, thanks for watching. See you next time.